First question, ma'am. When I was reading your book, and there's a particular place where you write that literally anything that was not known to them or was unknown or territories beyond home was considered India, quote unquote. And for me, this is a very interesting question because what was the idea of India in the European imagination? I mean, all of us know anecdotally about Columbus, who went somewhere and thought that was India, and also this India imaginary as a land, but also in terms of how it was envisioned. Could you tell us a little bit about it?
Thank you, Meena. And hopefully everyone can hear me. Yes, I can see nods among the audience. That's a really interesting question. So the book is about the early 17th century, 1614, around that kind of period. And that means it's before the British Empire had been formed at all. It would be another 150 years or so till the establishment of the British Empire. So we are talking about very early periods here. And in this period, you can think of India essentially, as I write in the book, as this abstraction of, in a way, Asian wealth of all kinds. But not just Asian wealth, but a particular kind of prominence. So just to give you one little example, one of the oldest maps of the European world is something called the Terrarum Orbis map, okay? Earths or worlds of the globe map. And it's a round with a T through the middle. All of the top hemisphere is called Asia or Indias. And the lower bit of the T is divided into two halves. One is Africa and one is Europe. And it made absolute sense to Europeans in the 12th and 13th centuries that Asia would have prominence at the top, because of course that is where Christ comes from, that is where all the wealth is, that is where the ancient classical Romans and Greeks went for knowledge. So Asia is at the top. And if any of you have ever heard the word orientation, or if you have had to orientate your maps, you'll know that that comes from this particular thing, that in olden days, rather nowadays, when we look at a map, we have north at the top. Till the 17th century, when you looked at a map, you'd put east at the top, the orient at the top. And that's why we have the term orientation. So India is very much both a figment of imagination, but also cornered on real cultural memories in this period.
Yeah. And this thing about the word you write about it, and it's very interesting because over time, and as we see all through history, the Orient came to stand for everything else, isn't it? Like, as opposed to the Occident. And thank you for this. I have another question again. When I was reading your book, I was fascinated about one of the things you write. Can you set the stage for the book before I go further? Because on one hand, a lot of this book is about the arrival of the first, quote-unquote, English ambassador from James I's court to Jahangir's court. But what's interesting and what is very beautifully written, I'm going to gush about it a little later, is how bankrupt England was at the time and how rich Jahangir's court was at the time. So,
yeah, okay. So just to get the timeline straight, perhaps, it might be useful to remind ourselves which period we're talking about. So this is around early 1600s, as I said. So if you think about the Mughal Empire in northern India in this period, then Akbar the Great is a direct contemporary of Elizabeth I in England. And by direct, I mean almost within a year or two, direct contemporaries. Akbar's son, Jahangir, is a direct contemporary of James I. Now, many of you will know that Elizabeth I did not have any children. So James, who was the king of Scotland, becomes the king now of Scotland and England. And there are many problems about this. One of the problems is that no one in England can understand his accent. He has a very heavy Scottish accent. So he talks, none of his English courtiers understand him. The second problem is a really practical problem, which is that the English economy is running out of money. And there's a very big reason for this. You'll remember that Elizabeth's father, Henry VIII, had broken away from the Catholic Church in continental Europe because he wanted to marry Anne Boleyn. So what that meant was that due to that Reformation, due to that break, English merchants had lost all their continental European connections, right? So if till that point, one of the things that England did really well was that they had their main principal export was wool. You know, it rains in England all the time. Lots of rain means lots of green grass. Lots of green grass means fluffy white sheep. So wool was a big export. Till this point, till the Reformation, that wool used to go to continental Europe, to Holland, for instance, to the Netherlands, to be processed and then to be sold. That was a major income stream. But that break from continental Europe meant, what does England do? It doesn't have those business connections. So, hey, surprise of all surprises, they have to find other trade partners in the global south. Certain things don't change. So, the point that I'm writing about is about 10 years after the East India Company has been established. So the East India Company is still finding its feet. It still isn't very confident. It's a fledgling thing. It's nothing like the behemoth it was going to become later on. And that's something really important to remember. When we think about empire, when we think about the company, we quite often think from a perspective in the 18th and 19th centuries. But the power relationship in this period is completely different. So at this point, if you think about the global economy, then the Mughals in India, the Safavids in Persia, modern-day Iran, the Ottomans in Turkey, and Ming China control most of the global economy. And among them, the Mughals are the second most richest nation, second very narrowly to Ming China. England, at the same time, is struggling. It has siphoned most of its national resources into its fights with Spain, so it has very little national resources left. And so they're desperate to find a market, a global market for English wool. So just to give you an example, a comparison, because those numbers are quite important, there's a point where an early English merchant under the East India Company says that Jahangir's annual income, personal annual income, so this is not the Mughal Empire's income, just the emperor's annual income is about the equivalent of 150 million pounds per year. England's national income, so not James's income, but the whole nation's income, is about 100 times less than that. So you can see the difference in power within which this poor man, Thomas Roe, is sent by James and by the East India Company to plead for an all-important trading license, because without that trading license, the English won't be able to trade in England, India.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for this, setting the scene, but also making us think of Brexit, because there's so much. As a writer, I often think, what's the purest form of seduction? Where do you find that? Is this between man and women? Is it women and women? But I'm always, and at some point, and especially after living in Chennai and seeing, how consul generals and others, who throw these parties, I always think the purest form of seduction is capital in search of a market. There's literally nothing that comes that close. So,
Absolutely.
So the thing that I wanted to ask you again is that when I was reading this book, and for some reason, I kept imagining this as a Netflix series. And it is so visual. I mean, like you can feel this man, and a lot of men can relate. He is a frustrated middle-aged man in some respects. He has a heartbreak. So, it makes him quite a likely hero, anti-hero.
There's another really important point, Meena, about Thomas Roe at this point, which is that he's made a marriage without his mother-in-law's permission, and his mother-in-law hates him.
Okay.
I mean, if
more
anything
drama.
will drive a man to try to find success, it will be the dream of getting his mother-in-law's approval.
Permission, approval, yeah. So it's all, I mean, it's all of this, but also, you know, the scenes of the court. So, I mean, what I want to know is, if you are going through documentation. I'm going to speak a little bit later about the East India Company's almost perverse necessity for documentation. But before that, how did you research the visual elements of the story?
Well, I think you've put your finger right on it. When I was writing this book, I was really conscious that that's one of the major things I wanted to convey. I'm a literary scholar by training, so I work on English literature of the 16th and 17th centuries. And for me, what was particularly important was trying to convey a sense of the visual, trying to convey a sense of the sensory experience of being in a different country. And in a way, art helps. So I made extensive use of paintings from both the Mughal court and from England in this period, but also literature helps. You know, sometimes when you're writing about history, we tend to assume that history is just about facts and figures, and we forget the human element within it. And that human element is so caught up in imagination, in experience, and that's exactly what I was trying to excavate.
So, I mean, thanks for bringing the human element. So, when we were just discussing Roe and, you know, the other dramatic aspects, he is constantly falling sick, or he's constantly writing about the fact of how sick and miserable he is. What are your thoughts a little bit on, you know, health in general, but also an Englishman troubled here by his experiences, and what does it generally say? I mean, was he trying to portray that he was going through great hardship for the company, or was it just...
Well, I think that's certainly the case. He's writing, so Roe wrote a daily journal, which is why we have so much material, and we'll talk about that perhaps in a little bit. But you basically know every day, sometimes hour by hour, what he did, what he ate, and sadly a lot about his stomach troubles in dreadful detail occasionally. Sometimes we honestly could have done with less detail on that. There were a couple of reasons for that. One was that Roe and most Europeans, and particularly the English at this point, just did not understand that they had to adapt their culinary, their eating habits to take into account temperature. So the fact that things spoil much more quickly, right, if you don't refrigerate them. If you're used to cooking something and keeping it for, say, 5 hours before eating it, you can do that in England. At this point in England, the temperature is about 10 degrees. So I could do that. If I cooked some dal in Oxford, where I live, I could leave that outside. It would be fine till the evening. I couldn't do it here. And this is a minor, seems like a very basic thing, but this is something that they didn't understand. But the other thing was that there were too much good food around. You could not avoid that temptation. I mean, Roe's kind of journals are full of descriptions of banquets of about 40, 50, 60 dishes. And he writes in detail about it. Poor man. I mean, he was rolling around in agony, and then he'd pop himself over to the darbar and see a banquet, and who could resist?
I have a quick question. This was supposed to come at the end. I mean, how was your food research like? Did you think you wanted to put like a book of recipes of Mughal India?
Well, you know what? Luckily, there are actually contemporary books of recipes from Jahangir's kitchen. And one of the things that the Mughals were excellent, they were almost as close to the East India Company at documenting things. Partly because, you know, their households were so huge. So if you wanted to throw a proper banquet, you needed to make sure that any new cook would be able to pick up on recipes that were devised by 2 generations before them.
Yeah.
So I'm afraid a lot of my research was in practice as well, trying to dig up these recipes from archives, from these Mughal recipe books, and trying to replicate them while wondering to myself how on earth I was going to replicate something that was designed to, cook for about 50 people into a meal for 2.
Okay. There's a place here you write, what remains of Rose's writing is a rare, privileged glimpse into what otherwise would have been missing completely. The journal, composed under East India Company's instructions, was part of the intangible profits of the company's investment in the voyage and embassy. And I think even Marx somewhere makes this comment about, the kinds of documentation that was going on by the East India Company. How do you look at this archive?
Okay, before I talk about that, I want to do a show of hands. Anyone here ever had to file an expense report? If you've gone for work and you had to claim that money back, anyone had to do anything like that or fill in a form? Anyone here had to fill in a form ever? Quite a few shows of hands. You remember the pain and the annoyance those forms caused? Trust me, historians in about 200 years' time are going to thank you for that. So one of the things that the East India Company loved, and they loved, really loved, was paperwork. They did not trust their employees. And we're talking not about Indian employees here. This was long time in the future to come. We're talking about English employees who had been sent over to various other countries. So they demanded paperwork and they demanded it in triplicate. They also demanded, oh yeah.
Okay.
You had to keep one with you. You had to submit another one to the headquarters in India, and the other one would be sent back on the ships.
Lovely.
But also, there was an absolute ground rule, which was that you wouldn't get paid your final salary till you submitted your day-to-day journal, so that the bosses back home in London could make sure that you had actually worked what you had said you had worked on. So as a historian, I was very, very lucky that on the English side, I had Rose's journal, but I also had multiple other journals and letters by various other East India Company merchants.
Lovely.
And on the flip side, on the Indian side, of course, there was the Jahangirnama. So Jahangir is one of the very rare global sovereigns of this period who actually writes a day-to-day memoir. So I'm in that rare position where I could identify a single day, say, if I wanted to find out what Roe was doing on 21st August 1619, I could open that day in Roe's journal. I could open the equivalent day in the Persian calendar in the Jahangirnama and see exactly what Roe was saying and what the emperor was saying.
Thank you to bring up Jahangir's journal. So this Roe has written pages and pages and pages of being in Jahangir's court or trying to get his deal. On the other hand, Jahangir, who I've read or heard, writes pages about his animals or his art, has no mention of Roe. Why do you think, and how did you feel that absence?
Firstly, I think one thing that I should say is that before starting writing this book, I was far more aware of Akbar and Shah Jahan than I was of Jahangir, and he's absolutely fascinating. I think he's so understudied in terms of the Mughal empires. He's kind of overshadowed by the one who goes before and after him, which is a bit sad, I think.
They skip a generation.
I know. But Jahangir is absolutely fascinating. He has a wonderful eye. He's startlingly honest about his own problems. He's very human in that sense. But he has absolutely no time for the English ambassador. And there's a very kind of fundamental, basic reason for that. The English are far too small a fish in a very large ocean in this point. When Roe comes to the Mughal court, the Mughals have no idea really of England. There are two reasons for this. The Portuguese had already been in India for about over a century by this point, and they had been very careful about not saying too much about the split in the church, which I mentioned earlier, where England broke away from the Catholic Church, because they didn't want to weaken the impression of the Catholic Church. So the English were minor, very minor for Jahangir. So if you look at that same page, 21st of August, 1619, Rowe goes on for about 5 pages talking about one particular conversation at Jahangir's court, at the Caste Darbar. You look at Jahangir's own entry for that same day, he goes on for about 4 pages, not 5, 4 pages, about the nesting habits of his pet Saras cranes. There's no reference to the English ambassador.
It's very disappointing. Is there a stage at which the English ambassador wins, if not the favors, the attention of Jahangir? Something you'd like to share with us?
Yeah, well, this comes about halfway through my book. So there's a point, Rowe struggles throughout to convey any sense of importance of England as a country to Jahangir, as I said, for practical reasons. The other practical reason is that both his king and the company who's employing him are both really cash-strapped and stingy. So they don't send very good presents or gifts. So that also affects his prestige. So one of the things that Rowe starts doing as he stays longer at the court, he starts understanding a little bit more about Jahangir as a person, rather than Jahangir as this Mughal emperor. And this is where what I was saying about the human element comes in. And he very quickly understands that if there's one thing that the Mughal emperor likes, it's art. Now, Rowe had brought with him a number of miniatures. Miniatures are, as you can think, the English miniatures are even smaller than miniatures within the Indian art tradition. They're about that big, usually. Tiny little portraits that you could wear as a locket, for instance, as a memorial. So Rowe brings quite a few of those. They're portable. You can put them in a box and carry them on a ship for 6 months. They don't get damaged. They're very convenient. So he starts gifting some of these miniatures to Jahangir. And there's a point where Jahangir enters a bet with Rowe. So Rowe says he's called to the Darbar one day, and Jahangir says, look, can you give me this miniature? I quite like it. Rowe says, well, I love this miniature. It's the portrait of someone who has died, whom I loved, so I can't give it to you. And the emperor says, that's fine. Tell you what, let's have a little bet. I'll ask one of my court artists to make multiple copies of your miniature. You say that English artists are good at painting portraits. Great. I'll ask him to make a few copies. If you can pick out your original from the copies, you keep that, and you keep any other copies you want. If you can't, then you have to give a prize to my court artist. 2 weeks later, Rowe is summoned back to the court, and a set of 10 miniatures is put down in front of you. I won't tell you who won that wager, but you can probably guess.
Thank you. You mentioned something I want to dig a little bit. He said he gave crappy gifts. What were I mean, I think Indians are very good at gift giving, but what were these crappy gifts?
Yeah, well, you see, the English always struggled with gifts. All the ambassadors who came to the English court, everywhere the English ambassadors went, everyone complained about English gifts in this point. And that's partly because...
It doesn't change a lot, though.
No, it's partly because both Elizabeth I and James I were notoriously stingy. They did not like to spend money. But there's another reason for this. So partly, it's also a business reason, in the sense that a lot of the investors in the East India Company were also investors in the Virginia Company. And the Virginia Company is the company that was going to Northern America in this period. So partly, those investors, if you think about these businessmen, right, in the middle of London, in Fenchurch Street, in the city of London, they were sitting there making decisions about what gifts to send to both of these parts of the world. And some of them assumed that what was going down well in Northern America would go down well in Mughal India, which was not the case. So Rowe writes endless letters, not only him, all the East India Company merchants write endless letters like, please don't send us cheap knives and beads, because no one will pay at a second glance here. But when Roe is sent, he is sent with, I mean, they do push the boat out a little bit, so they send him 2 proper gifts. But here's the problem. The 2 gifts they sent, one of them is a carriage, a horse-drawn carriage. And the other one is a virginal, which is an earlier form of a piano. Now, if you think about it, both of these things are made out of wood. And what happens to wood if they're packed in a ship's hold, so in the bottom bit of a ship, and sent on a journey down the equator, down the Tropic of Cancer, across Cape Horn, across the whole of that length of the sea around Africa, to come to Surat. It's not good, Meena. I mean, by the time Roe took those things out, they were pretty much falling apart. So he had to, in Surat, where the English landed, he had to quickly get local artisans to do a kind of repair job on these things. Now, Jahangir was very polite. He politely took those gifts, accepted them, and said thank you to Roe. But then the very next day, he got his own court kind of craftsmen to basically make multiple copies of both the virginal and particularly the carriage, replace all the iron nails with gold and silver nails, and proper Indian velvet, and then paraded them out in a procession. Roe was not pleased. It was embarrassing for him.
Yeah, I can imagine. There's some of these things from the journals I would like to kind of flag and want you to reflect a little bit on them. There's somewhere he writes, the country is all slavish, and even in the city of Burhanpur, except for the castle and some few ill houses of commanders to which the English had no access, their living conditions were worse than one would offer to pigs at home. In general, this idea of, talking about Indians as a slavish people, or, this very comparison to animals, it's very dehumanizing, isn't it? How do you look at how Roe or, later officials of the East India Company looked at Indian people, like the natives?
I think that's a really interesting question, and it's perhaps slightly more the answer is perhaps more complicated than it looks on the surface. So I'll take the second bit of that. So this is Roe grumbling about the living conditions, okay? What he doesn't understand is that the living conditions were not a lack of magnificent living in India in this period, but the fact that he wasn't paid any importance. So he comes from England assuming that the Indians are going to welcome him with open arms because he's an ambassador. But here's the thing, before him, for about 10 years, while the East India Company had been trying to get this trading license, multiple merchants had pretended to be an ambassador. So no one takes him seriously. They don't offer him any state accommodation. So basically what the East India Company has to do is just rent a random place everywhere they go. So there's a big mismatch between what he was hoping for in terms of Indian magnificence and what he actually gets because of the lack of importance of the English in the country. The other question of slavery, and this is a really interesting one. So if you think of it from our post-colonial perspective and our perspective from beyond what happens in terms of the British Empire, this seems like a very obvious kind of comparison to make. Okay, the Indians are all slavish and therefore we'll rule over them. Which is true in the later period, and that's how Roe's journal is seen. But when Roe is writing, his comment is from a completely different perspective. His comment is from the perspective of an England where the Parliament and the King were already at loggerheads with each other. So you'll remember in about 40 years' time, England is going to behead its king because of the quarrel between the Parliament and the King. And the question, the main debate there will be that the king is treating the people and the Parliament as slaves. So when Roe comes to India and sees the power of the king, all the warning bells are going off in his head about that debate, about autocratic power, about the power of sovereignty. And that's what he's getting at.
Okay. and he doesn't understand why people are happy to be subservient.
Yeah.
So the other question is that throughout this book, I mean, not just you, but history, the records, his own self-assessment treats him as a failure. And if he was a failure, what is it that makes him or his entry point or his history that important for us to read or engage with?
Yeah, well, that is the $1 million or £1 million question, I think. Yes, I mean, Rowe's embassy is a miserable failure in all accounts. He's given 2 jobs. This man in his 30s is told, look, you have to do 2 things. One is get this exclusive trading license. And 2, you've got to impress the Mughal emperor, who's one of the greatest emperors in the world, that James I is also pretty great, actually. And we know that because James writes this in a letter, which still survives. He fails to do both of them. In fact, he's so much of a failure that the East India Company won't send another ambassador for about 80 years after this. So why is he important? The reason for that is his journal. So one of the things that happens later on when the East India Company establishes itself is that they keep going back to Rowe's journal for essential information about the Mughal court, about India, about trade, about language, about the food, all of those things. So in a way, Rowe's journal and many of those assumptions, many of those criticisms he makes as an individual get taken as given truths, established truths about India. And later on in the 18th century, if you think about Robert Clive, even later in the 19th century, you see assumptions about India which have actually come from him rather than from later kind of actual facts.
Oh. This is very interesting. I just have a random question, sorry. In Rowe's journals, how do you think the idea of caste is dealt with? I mean, like, how did it exist in the early 17th century? Is there a mention of it, or is he oblivious to it?
Rowe does not explicitly mention caste. The clergyman who comes with him, and every ship sent a Christian clergyman on the ship. So there's a man called Edward Terry who comes as Rowe's chaplain. He mentions caste, but very briefly. And the reason for that is because if you're not aware of how the caste system works, from an external point of view, particularly from a deeply hierarchical society like England, from that superficial level, a caste system looks like the class system in England in this period.
So they were misreading what they were saying?
They were misreading, they were miscoding what they were seeing, and thinking of it simply in terms of class rather than caste, quite often.
And this, he travels to Surat, Ajmer, Lucknow. Is there any mention or engagement with the South, or is it that the East India Company comes much later to the South?
The East India Company comes significantly later to the South. For Rowe, he's aware of the southern regions, deeply conscious that they are still independent from Mughal rule, for instance. So he talks about that. But what drives him is the fact that his competitors, his closest competitors at this point are the Dutch. Yeah. Okay, the other Protestant naval nation. But it's the Dutch who are trying to establish bases down south. It's the Dutch who will first come to Chennai, they'll come to Masulipatam, they will start establishing warehouses down here. So for Rowe, it seems a given that if Western India, mid-Western India is taken by the Portuguese, if the Dutch are establishing their bases in the south, it's only the north left for the English. They're always late in these things compared to their European competitors.
They managed to prevail. One of the other things that I was, towards the very end of the book, you speak about this exhibition that's held in England and about how, the wax museum it is not a museum at that point. They'd already started making these wax figures, but they also import, or rather bring in Indian snake charmers, dancers, whatever, to give this flavor of the local. Why was colonialism, it was not colonialism at that point, but why were they so interested in exhibiting people? This is common to not just the British, but also the rest of Europe. The first question I think is about, I'm going to ask 2 questions at once because then I'll open the floor.
Yeah.
What is it about non-white bodies that they find that interesting, because they were doing all kinds of measurements as well, later in the histories, that it necessitated this exhibition thing. And the second thing is about food, and where you say that, they have all of this Indian food prepared, where they also associate somehow the spiciness of the food with masculinity.
Yeah, two fabulous questions. So this point that Meena is talking about comes in the epilogue of my book. So right at the end, I kind of jump forward a few centuries to the end almost of Queen Victoria's rule, to something called the Great Indian Exhibition. And this is like a mela, right? It's like a huge fair held in a huge span of land, which was owned by the railway companies at this period. And they had a huge theater. You could go around shops, buy Indian stuff. You could look at Indian kind of music and dance. You could eat Indian food. Partly it's because it's catering towards people who had been to India or whose families had been to India. So you might be a late 19th century family whose bread earner, the man of the family, is posted in India and keeps talking about what they have seen. So if you happen to be the wife and the daughters, you might come to the Great Indian Exhibition and experience a part of that. Or you might be a retired colonial official, and you might want to recreate the days of your youth in India by coming to this fair. So there was partly that, exoticism, but you were asking me about the bodies, and that's really interesting. So this particular exhibition brought over about 3,000 people from India, and they came from all walks of life. What gave me particular pleasure, so I grew up in Calcutta, in Kolkata, in eastern India, and what gave me particular pleasure when I was looking through the list of people who had come over was the name of a sweet maker, a Bengali sweet maker. Wow. And it's from a family whose sweet shop still exists.
Yes, it does. No.
In central Calcutta. So it was wonderful to have that sense of familiar names in this space. I think you're right that there is something about sensationalism, about seeing foreign bodies. And perhaps this occurs both ways. It occurs also when those of us who look different go into a different space. And we attract eyes, right? We attract people who want to see us. But in this case, it was also, you have to remember that this was right at the end of the Victorian period. It was a point where colonial control was already failing. Mm-hmm. So it was also, in a way, an instrument of reassurance, of control. Mm-hmm. They have this great theatrical extravaganza where Victoria is kind of recreated as a goddess of the empire. And at the end, they have this mechanism which someone plays the part of Victoria, and she's pulled up by a pulley to the heavens. Wow. At the end. So there's a lot of kind of reassertion of power going on, I think, through that exhibition as well.
Thank you. The thing is, I remember being in conversation in this festival with two men over the last 2 days. And every time they were talking about anything, I was trying to bring it back to women. Whatever their answer was, I was trying to ask a feminist question. And with you, I'm completely not. What is the role of women through this book? I mean, like, I did mention somewhere that, he was carrying one heartbreak, but also there's Cecilia, who he was in love with, who many other men were in love with. They were writing, nasty poems or something. But where do women figure in this, both in Jahangir's court, James I's court, and East India Company?
Well, that's a really important question, I think. Usually, I think if you're thinking about histories of empire, if you're thinking about histories of cross-cultural interaction in general, women play a very minor role in this period. We're far more comfortable talking about big concepts like trade and economy and religion. And those individual figures get lost. So for me, it was particularly important to pay due attention, not only to women like Nur Jahan, who is immensely powerful at the Mughal court, and actually I argue is immensely powerful in terms of determining the fortunes of the English at the Mughal court in this period, but also the English perception of Nur Jahan, which I argue is framed very much by another powerful woman at the English court, Anna of Denmark, who's James I's wife. So she gets written out of most of the histories, English histories in this period. But not just them, but there are numerous other women throughout this period, educated, particularly in India. Mughal women control their own finances, they deeply invest in trade, so their role is particularly important. In fact, the English first get the attention of the Mughals because their rivals, the Portuguese, make a very, very crucial mistake. Roughly around few years before Roe arrives in India, the Portuguese they were doing this thing of capturing Mughal ships and asking for ransom. And the Mughals were fine with that. They would pay the ransom. But they made the mistake of capturing a ship, one of the biggest Mughal ships called the Rahimi, which was owned by the emperor's mother. And the Mughal Empire absolutely clamped down on the Portuguese at that point. And they realized that they needed another European power to play off against the Portuguese. And that's when they start paying the English more attention.
That's what happens when you mess with women.
Exactly.
I'm going to throw the floor open to questions. We have about 15 minutes more. Yes.
Well, okay. My name is Brandon. I'm an American historian, but I've had an interest in U.S.-India relations and generally the relationship between India and the West. So I was wondering a lot about specifically Jahangir's impression of England at the time. I mean, like you explained how the East India Company had a pretty hard time of getting permission to establish themselves in Mughal India. And that, I mean, Roe wasn't even mentioned by Jahangir explicitly, which makes it seem like he thought he was unimportant. And kind of, I guess, from a political trade perspective, if he saw him as unimportant, why allow him to open up trade, or at what point did he start to potentially see him or England as a threat to his own rule and sovereignty? And I guess kind of as an add-on to that, if you can kind of smush these together, I'm also curious as to when or in what way the perception between England and India along cultural lines developed. I guess my perception is in the sort of dominating point of view of England, where they tend to would look down on and kind of decry cultural gender relations, sexual relations in India. So I'm just thinking through the point of view of gender and sexual relations, I guess.
Okay, I'll take your first question first. So I think you have to, one of the most important things in this period is that you have to think about the Mughal court itself not as a single entity. So the emperor by himself does not represent Mughal state policy. The Mughal court is divided into multiple factions. Jahangir's own interest in Roe is largely cultural. He's curious. He's curious about this different culture. He spends ages asking Roe about English music, English beer making, all kinds of other things. The people who are more conscious of the political valence or the political importance that the English might have are Nur Jahan and Khurram, who will become Shah Jahan later on. And you can see from the negotiations that they're doing that both of those factions are very carefully and deliberately playing the English against the Portuguese in this period. Your second question about when that familiar dynamics or the familiar power balance will come into play, that begins to come into play from the end of the 17th century onwards. So it's post Aurangzeb that you start having those terms being defined much more clearly. Certainly not during the time of Jahangir, and not even really by the Norris Embassy, which is 80 years after Roe. Thank you.